Because they're not
And you're
prepared, but they don't know what to do with it. They don't know what to do with the snow, so they close the
And the people from the north know not to get on the road with those people in the south. That's why Ellie says, I'm not getting on the road.
Maybe they should have come back by train sometimes. I don't know if the train runs from Houston to.
It's a hard, they were there for the hurricanes in the summer, and now they're there for the snowstorm.
Right, and the heat.
But Yosefa says it's very nice to live in Houston. She says it's really very nice there.
But she does wanna come back.
They want to be closer to the family, but they're not happy about being in cold weather. They have friends there, they've established a life there.
All right, so we're gonna get started, and then we can get home 5 minutes earlier. So so the material that's in front of you is from the last class. Okay, but just in case you didn't get it. So it turns out, I didn't necessarily know this when I set up the classes, but it turns out the theme for this series has been crossing boundaries. Really, boundaries between heaven and earth, boundaries between life and death, and perhaps even boundaries between past, present, and future. And certainly between the rational and visible, and the imagination and beyond. In the first class, we looked at individuals and groups, and even some birds, if you check the sources, who entered paradise alive. Okay, and then we looked at the question whether Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, continued to have a terrestrial space after the expulsion of Adam and Chava. So that's just, and you didn't have to be at any of those classes to be here tonight. But it, as I said, as I was preparing them, these themes emerged, and sometimes the material connected, which I hadn't expected. So tonight we're going to be exploring the idea of the bat kol in the rabbinic mind. Anybody heard that phrase before? Know what it means? What does it mean when you say a bat kol?
I've heard it, I don't know what
You don't know what it is?
Is it like
Voice.
Voice from heaven.
A voice from heaven. Well, that was the title of the class, but yeah. That works.
I was going to say something.
Same thing. Okay. So something about a voice from up there that gets here. That's what we're going to look at today. So in the rabbinic mind, there was the possibility of the experience of God crossing to the commanded or certainty, crossing the commanding or certainty boundary after the time that, according to Jewish tradition, God doesn't communicate the way that God used to communicate with biblical characters. Okay, so bat kol, whatever that's going to be, we'll kind of get there, is a rabbinic idea, rabbinic construct, mostly rabbinic. It's not a biblical idea. Okay. My first exposure to the idea of a bat kol, let's call it a voice from heaven, was when I learned the story of the oven of Achnai. I see a couple of people nodding their head at this story, the oven of Achnai, and others of you looking like, what is she talking about? That's fine. I probably heard the story in USY, although maybe it wasn't until I was an undergraduate at JTS. This is a story in which the rabbis are considering the purity, whether a certain oven gets purity or doesn't need to worry about that. And one rabbi disagreed with all the other rabbis. He calls for divine intervention, and he gets divine intervention, and yet the other rabbis still rule against his position. Okay, is that ringing a bell for anybody else who didn't think it? Yeah, okay, good. So don't tell the story yet, because we're going to look at it. This text, which we will look at, I promise, was presented to me as fundamental and critical to understanding rabbinic authority to make halakha, and as a justification for the conservative movement's process of legal interpretation. We just started, Dave. Come on. Okay, so we're going to look at that story. That was the first time I ever heard this phrase, bat kol. There's another well known and often quoted story in which a bat kol is heard, makes a statement about legal process and practice with two seemingly different contradictory parts. We'll look at this story too, but give you a heads up. After Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai have been debating a particular law, or maybe more than one law, for 3 years and not resolving the issue, a bat kol comes and it says a very famous phrase, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These and these are the words of the living God. Is that a phrase that people have heard before? Okay. But the text goes on and the bat kol goes on to say, but the halacha kebeit Hillel. Law is like Beit Hillel. And you may be aware that in general, although we always say Beit Shammai says this and Beit Hillel says that, according to most understandings of Talmudic law, except for 3 times, the law is always like Beit Hillel. Okay? So we have this text that says both Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are telling you God's word, but the halakha is like Beit Hillel. So those are the two classic stories, and we'll get to them. The bat kol seems to be one of those Jewish ideas that we may have heard of and wondered about, but it's also less familiar and less studied than I had realized. In imagining the class, I thought that there would be any number of examples of a bat kol engaging in and determining halachic decisions. I assumed that we would look at the 2 cases I mentioned, but the other cases that I assumed were out there in the Talmud or in the Midrash. And I thought that there would be some consistent way in which a bat kol behaves, and we would be able to understand something about it and its role in particular in determining halacha. I should have known better. In fact, spoiler alert, in rabbinic literature, the 2 cases above are among very few situations in which a bat kol tries to influence directly or indirectly halacha. But a bat kol does engage and appear lots of other times. So I think all of us are going to leave this evening with more mystery and less clarity about bat kol than when we started. So what is a bat kol? Biblically, a call is a voice or the sound of God's speech and power. The word call is used when in the revelation at Mount Sinai, right? Moshe yedaber, Moshe spoke, ve'Elohim yanenu b'kol, and God answered him b'kol, in a voice. Okay, Kabbalat Shabbat Friday night, and when we return the Torah on Saturday morning, we sing Psalm 929. Call Adonai b'koach, call Adonai b'chadar, call Adonai, right? The voice of God is in the thunder and in the strength, okay? And the thundering sound of God's power, but it's also in Elijah's still small voice. The same word call is used, and we know it from Unatana Tokef, call demama, a quiet voice is heard. God speaks throughout the Torah directly and indirectly to the members of the first Jewish families, to Moshe, to Aaron, to judges, to some of the kings, and eventually to the prophets. The prophets hear from God and they transmit God's word. But does God continue to speak, giving directions after the Babylonian exile and the establishment of the Second Temple. This is one of the significant questions of the Second Temple period and in the aftermath of its destruction. And I think it remains a question today, even when we don't talk about it so directly. A bat kol is often translated as the echo of a voice, although that's not quite accurate since it's assumed to be the voice itself, whereas an echo is not actually the voice itself. Or the daughter of a voice, bat kol would be the literal, that literal translation, which is something closely related to the voice, but not exactly the voice itself. Or it's some kind of disembodied voice. While there isn't really the phrase kol min hashamayim, which is what would be if we said a heavenly voice or a voice from it, that's not such a used phrase, if at all. A bat kol is understood to be some kind of revelation from the divine, but not like we used to get in biblical times. The phrase bat kol occurs over 100 times in the Babylonian Talmud, as well as in collections of Midrash and the Jerusalem Talmud and the Tosefta. It is not found in the Bible, with the possible exception of something in the book of Daniel. And there are only 2 uses in the Mishnah. Right? So the Mishnah is earlier in time than the Talmud, and one of those 2 uses may actually be the word bat kol, may actually refer to a disembodied human voice. It's interesting there that it shows up in the question of our accepting less than perfect testimony to free a woman whose husband has been died, but it can't be proved. And if you hear a bat kol, so that's the question: might it be a heavenly voice, or might it just be somebody shouting from a mountain somewhere, saying, "I saw the body, but I can't come to tell you." And the other one is in Pirkei Avot, but in the 6th chapter, which is actually understood to be later than Mishnah. So it is a little bit later than Mishnah. It is found in some of those books, some of the books that are in those yellow books on the shelf there that I've shown you before, outside the Bible, which is the literature of the Second Temple and later, that didn't make it into the Jewish canon. And was often preserved for us by Christian sources, but was originally, the basically Jewish sources. And we'll see one of those texts. Okay. The articles that I found gave all kinds of different characteristics and kind and purpose of a bat kol in any given situation, but there isn't any one systematic way of understanding it. A bat kol may appear. It may occasionally be summoned. It may speak in Hebrew or in other languages, or not in words at all. It may sound male or female. It may address issues of the status of an individual in this world or the next, or someone not even conceived yet. It addresses Jews and non-Jews, especially enemy kings and generals. It rebukes the high and mighty. It offers comfort, or it does not offer comfort. It addresses humans, trees, and mountains. So how should I organize tonight's class? I'm not really going to look at the history or the technical issues of the dating and trying to make sense of the appearances, although there are people trying to understand that. So what I'm going to do is start with those 2 cases of halakha, and maybe touch a little bit on how 2 medieval authorities understood those. And then we're just going to look at an assortment of texts which are interesting to me. And they will pull in some of the characters that we've met in our previous classes. And perhaps as we go through this, we'll think about what was intended when using the concept to express divine communication in some ongoing way. Why did the rabbis create, because they did create this, and why did they use it? So I hope you have fun. And here we go. Now we'll do text. this time I hopefully organized them a little bit better so you have the question for each section or what I'm trying to focus on in each section. So I do want to see, does anybody need it? I have more text.
You have more? Oh, wait, there's no more.
Yeah, there are only 4 pages this time, so.
Everybody got?
Okay, so the first question that I wanted to put out there, actually, before we get to the halakhic material, or possibly halakhic material, is why did the rabbis need to create a bat kol? Or why did God give us a bat kol, which is, of course, going to be the language of the Talmud. And so one question I want to ask you is, during the biblical period, how did the Jews or how did rabbinic authorities know what God wanted?
They really didn't, because there were places in the Talmud in the Torah that are opposite to other things in the Torah.
Okay, so that becomes one of the problems we have, right? Which is, so what you're saying by saying that, I think, is in theory, the Torah should tell us what God wants,
But it doesn't.
but you're not sure it does. Okay. So how else did Jews know during the biblical period what God wanted, particularly in the context of the temple? There actually was a particular set of tools. Yeah, the umim and tumim that were on the breastplate of the high priest. And if you asked the right question, or if you asked the question in the right way, or if God wanted you to know,
But that's magic.
well, but they didn't understand it as magic, right? They understood it as a legitimate way, okay? And if you saw that, you knew, okay? And then what was the other, yeah?
So how did the women answer?
It-
High priest.
There was a way of reading them. So maybe that's the next class, we'll do in the spring. I actually don't know the answer to that, but it was clear. When it answered, it was clear to whoever needed to know. What was another way that the Jews felt that God was communicating with them? Prophets. Okay. So we have a problem. The earliest stories, right? Abraham and Isaac too, and Jacob and some of those other people, even Hagar heard from God. You didn't have to be a patriarch to hear directly from God, but certainly there's a principle that as we get further and further into the Torah and then into the middle books of the Bible and to the end of the Bible, God speaks less and less directly. Okay, so the problem becomes, what do you do when, or what happens when you don't have the Urim and Tumim and you don't have prophets? Because prophecy ends with the last prophets, who are where did they go? Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Okay, so the two texts at the top, they're similar but a little bit different. So you know what, Sam, real quickly if you could read the first text for me, the Sota 48.
Okay. Come in here, when the first temple was destroyed, the cities and with pastures.
Okay, so these are the cities that belong to the Levites. Okay.
Cities of pasture land were abolished. The Umim and Tumim ceased. There was no more a king from the house of David. And if anyone incites you to quote, and the governor said unto that they should not eat of the most holy
Don't worry
things.
about that part. Let's pick it up at but says Rabbi Nachman. So they've raised the problem. We don't have Levites anymore. We don't have the Urim and Tumim. We don't have the kings from David who have a certain legitimacy to say what they say. Okay, so now go down near the bottom where it says, but Rabbi Nachman.
But said Rabbi Nachman, who are the foreign prophets, excluding Haggai,
Zechariah and
Zechariah
Malachi.
and Malachi, who are the later prophets. For our rabbis have taught when Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi died, the Holy Spirit departed from Israel. Nevertheless, they made use of the bat kol.
Okay, so there seem to be two terms, or there seemed to be a way that the prophets heard from God. Okay, Moses, how did Moses and God talk? Face to face, panim ma panim. Later, people didn't even the prophets saw through a glass that was clouded, all kinds of expressions. Ruach HaKodesh, which you can probably all translate, right? Ruach HaKodesh is Holy Spirit. So it's not the Christian Holy Spirit, although there may be connections, and that becomes part of the Second Temple and post-destruction early Christian and Jewish debates around this idea of the Ruach HaKodesh. That's what the Holy Spirit is. But the Ruach HaKodesh seems to be something that disappeared when there were no longer the prophets that could be inspired by it. But God gives us at least, they had this thing called bat call, whatever bat call is. Okay, and Joanne, do you mind reading from the Song of Songs, from Midrash Song of Songs? It's a comment on I am a wall, which don't worry about it.
Rav Avihu said the Holy One, blessed be he, it is my intention to assign to Israel an advocate among the nations. What is this? The bat kol, as it says, except the Lord of hosts had left unto us a very small remnant.
Okay, so you have the idea. This is Isaiah. I think that at least we had a little bit left to come back from exile to reestablish, right? But the idea here is that kind of God isn't so much there anymore, but at least God left us a remnant. That remnant is the bat call. But keep reading.
It has been taught. With the death of the last prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the Holy Spirit departed from Israel, but still the bat call was available to them.
Okay, and as you see, this is the teaching about bat kol. Like it's always in reference to the three last prophets, and the loss of the Ruach HaKodesh, but we get a bat kol that has something for us. Okay, and I love that phrase, was still available to them. Okay, it's a kind of a sweet way. I'm going to have you read the next part, which we're going to get a story about a bat kol. And almost always when you get this statement about the bat kol replacing prophecy, you get this next story and a couple of other stories. So we'll before we get to the halachic material, we'll take one moment with this. So go ahead.
Once when the sages were debating a point in the upper chamber of Beit Gadia in Jericho, a bat kol went forth and said, there is among you a man who is fitted to receive the Holy Spirit, but his generation is not worthy of the privilege. And they fixed their eyes on the elder Hillel. When he died, they mourned him, saying, ah, modest, ah, pious soul, worthy disciple of Ezra.
Okay, what's this story saying? And pay attention to what phrase is used or
Even Hillel didn't get it.
what?
Even Hillel.
What was Hillel? Well, we'll come back to whether it was Hillel, but what was Hillel worthy to have been? A prophet, right? He was worthy to have the Ruach HaKodesh, but his generation wasn't worthy to have somebody speak through the Ruach HaKodesh. Okay? And again, so it's an ending, it's not that there weren't people who were good enough to get the Ruach HaKodesh, but the generation wasn't. But at least we get this bat kol. Now, what's interesting here? Did the bat kol tell them who the person was? No, they just made that assumption. So here, the bat kol says something, but it doesn't necessarily give you all the information you want. And there's a couple of other stories like this, a similar another rabbi who was worthy of the Ruach HaKodesh doesn't get it, but people sort of assume they know who it is, and the same situation. But those two pieces are almost always connected. I'm not sure why, but they are. Okay, so now let's go ahead and read the two classic texts, which are does a bat kol decide halacha. So, Jay, could you continue with the Eruvin text?
Yeah. Rav Abba stated in the name of Shmuel, for 3 years there was a dispute between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, the former asserting the halacha is in agreement with our views, and the latter contending the halacha is in agreement with our views. Then a bat kol issued announcing the utterances of both are the words of the living God. But the halacha is in agreement with the rulings of Beit Hillel.
Okay. Before we get to the next part, what do you think the problem of the Gemara is going to be?
Well, they just argued, and they said both of them are right, but Hillel is more right.
Right. So the Gemara is going to say why, right? Why is that? If they're both, any good answers?
My speculation is that Hillel was more often more lenient and more compassionate. That it's the only thing I can immediately
Okay.
comes to mind.
So from what you think you know and what you think you've been taught, because we've all been taught this, you think that Hillel is more compassionate
Yeah.
and okay.
Didn't just go over the board.
All
It
right.
could also just be like, okay, you have to make a decision somehow, so just move on. Like 3 years is too long to spend doing this. Just get it over it.
Okay. And this is an issue for us. This is a major issue in pluralism. How long and how far apart can the legal decisions of the Jewish community, what happens when you have two opinions about two laws about everything? Okay, it's a problem. We're not going to stop on that problem, but it is significant and it is a major problem. And on a certain level, it's nice to know we're not the only Jewish generation that struggles with that question. So go ahead, Joe. Let's read the answer here.
Since, however, both are the words of the living God, what was it that entitled Beit Hillel to have the halacha fixed in agreement with their rulings? Because they were kindly and modest, they studied their own rulings and those of Beit Shammai, and were even so humble as to mention the actions of Beit Shammai before theirs as...
It's okay, don't go any further, okay? So those are the reasons, according to this text. In a sense, moral reasons, kindness reasons, and then you get into all these discussions about why do we study Beit Hillel's positions as well. All that goes really interesting places. That may not be the reason. We're going to look at the next text and we're going to see whether any of these are sufficient reason to go by Beit Hillel as opposed to Beit Shammai. But the Bat Kol at least said, and the Gemara gives us a couple of reasons. Okay? Faith, you ready for the good story? Not that they aren't all good stories. You're going to start where this was the Oven of Achnai. They've started debating already, but it wasn't worth getting that page. So why the Oven of Achnai? Why did they call it that? Start actually a couple of lines later where it says, on that day, Rabbi Eliezer.
On that day, Rabbi Eliezer brought forward every imaginable argument, but they did not accept them. Said he to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let this carob tree prove it. Thereupon the carob tree was torn 100 cubits out of its place, others affirm 400 cubits. No proof can be brought from a carob tree, they retorted. Again he said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let the stream of water prove it. Whereupon the stream of water flowed backwards. No proof can be brought from a stream of water, they rejoined. Sounds like Moshe, right? Again he urged, if the halacha agrees with me, let the walls of this schoolhouse prove it. Whereupon the walls inclined to fall. But Rabbi Joshua rebuked them, saying, when scholars are engaged in a halachic dispute, what have ye to interfere? Hence they did not fall in honor of Rabbi Joshua, nor did they resume the upright in honor of Rabbi Eliezer, and they are still standing, thus inclined. Again he said to approved from heaven. Whereupon a heavenly voice cried out, "Why do ye dispute with Rabbi Eliezer, seeing that in all matters the halakha agrees with him?" But Rabbi Joshua arose and exclaimed, "It is not in heaven. What did he mean by this?" Said Rabbi Jeremiah, "That the Torah had already been given at Mount Sinai. We pay no attention to a heavenly voice because thou hast long since written in the Torah at Mount Sinai, after the majority must one incline."
Okay, don't go any further for the moment. Right, so I hope some of you are now even more when this story is coming back to you, right? If you've heard it, right? So there's all these signs that come from heaven. Rabbi Eliezer's absolutely right, and finally a bat call comes from heaven, right? And in this case, right, in the first case, the bat call kind of appeared and said, "This is Elu ve'elu," right? Here, it's responding to Rabbi Eliezer's request, okay? And why you disagree. I mean, it goes even further, right? The law should be like Rabbi Eliezer, the Bat Kol asked. And Rabbi Joshua says what's another key phrase in contemporary conservative law, "Lo b'shamayim hi." It's not in heaven, which comes actually from the end of Deuteronomy, from the Tzavim, from one of my favorite parshiot, and it's the idea that Torah is available to all of us, right? But Rabbi Joshua uses it very differently. When he says "Lo b'shamayim hi," right? He's saying Torah is not in heaven anymore. Torah belongs to human beings, and the heavenly, even God, has no right to make halakha because in the Torah, God told us how to make halakha. Okay? And the way that we make halakha is that the majority rules. Okay? Which other Talmudic sources say should have been the reason between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai was because Beit Hillel was actually much more numerous than Beit Shammai. And why did they go through the process of giving all these reasons why? They said because Beit Shammai are better, their minds are actually sharper. So they had to, so even though there's not more of them, they're better scholars, but we still go by Beit Hillel. Don't get carried away with this. But it's actually interesting, these discussions about what the process of making law is. Okay, and so this again is that important text for conservative Judaism, but even the person who wrote a well-known book, or at least a well-known title, "It's Not in Heaven," was Eliezer Berkowitz, who was actually an Orthodox rabbi trying to explain Jewish law. Okay, so it is our understanding of Jewish law that it's not in heaven, it's in the Torah, which was given to us, and we have our own process. And then because I said that we're going to keep meeting some characters that we've met before, Faith, just continue with the very last part when Rabbi Nathan.
Rabbi Nathan met Elijah and asked him, "What did the Holy One, blessed be he, do in that hour?" He laughed with joy. He replied, saying, "My sons have defeated me. My sons have defeated me."
Right, so we know that Eliyahu is one of those people who crosses the boundaries and crosses back and forth. He was one of the 10 who went up to heaven, but he's showing up here again and saying that God appreciates, apparently, even though God sent the bat kol, or a bat kol came, again, not clear, does God send the bat kol or not? And God said, "Yeah, you're right. You guys understand Torah better than I do right now, maybe." So it's sort of interesting. Okay, we're actually doing well. We may get through most of our sources. So in line with this, and there really aren't that many other cases of a bat kol in those 100 cases. I didn't go through all of them, and not all of the scholars went through all of them. But there's really very few in which it's about making halacha. Really, bat kol does all kinds of other things. It may want to influence halacha, but it doesn't get involved as directly that way. It's teaching other things, apparently, and we'll look at some of that. Okay, so we're gonna see a piece. This next does the bat kol ensure that justice happens? We're gonna see a couple of things. Um, and one of them is that even though we said that bat kol is a post-biblical thing, in the Talmud and in the mind of the rabbis, bat kol also spoke during the biblical period and spoke to biblical characters who somehow needed a bat kol rather than God. I don't. That's one of the things I don't understand, and maybe we'll think about it as we see. But Steve, you want to read the next section?
Rabbi Elazar said the Holy Spirit manifested itself in three places: at the tribunal of Shem, at the tribunal of Samuel of Ramah, and at the tribunal of Solomon. At the tribunal of Shem, as it is written, and Judah acknowledged them, and he said, "She is right, it is from me."
That's when he was told that Tamar was pregnant, and Tamar said, "The guy who belongs to these, his daughter-in-law, the guy who belongs to these things, that's who made me pregnant." And it was really up to Judah to save her life or not.
How did he know for certain? Maybe, just as he had come to consort with her, some other man had come to consort with her. But it was a bat kol that came forth and said, "She is right. Constrained by me, these things came about."
Okay, and it's not clear who heard that bat call. Okay, we can assume that who for sure heard that bat call.
So this takes away the feeling that the instruments that she presented to the court were not valid. I mean, they're not taking that as the reason that
Well, he took them as,
it's too many explanations.
Judah took them as the explanation.
Judah took them as the explanation, but they were certainly his.
Yeah.
But the suggestion is made. So he gave them to her, and somebody might have come an hour later and she might not have left, right? So it's pretty clear to me, at least in reading this, that Judah heard the bat call. That's how he knew for sure that he wasn't going to be able to push this off on anybody else. But I don't know for sure that anybody else heard the bat call. And that's one of the things we're going to see with the bat call. Who hears it, who's listening. Okay, so that's case one. And it was Shem, if you remember the yeshiva of Shem and Ever, that those pre-Abraham people, but somehow they had a yeshiva and they show up periodically. That's where Isaac was after the Akedah. He went to yeshiva because you have a traumatic experience like that. Where else do you go but yeshiva? Anyway, so they're still holding. Okay, the second case.
At the tribunal of Samuel, as it is written, "Here I am, witness against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken, or whose ass?" And they said, "Thou hast not defrauded us, nor oppressed us, neither hast thou taken aught of any man's hand." And he said unto them, "The Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day, that ye have not found aught in my hand." And he said, "He is witness, bat kol." I'm sorry. And he said, "Should it not be?" And they said, "But it was a bat kol that came forth and said, I am witness in this matter."
So I don't want to get into all of the grammar that's going on here, but basically this is at the end of Samuel's life when the people say, "Give us a king." And Samuel says, "Why? I've been good. I've been honest. I haven't taken anything from you." And apparently there was some sort of large testimony here going on. And the bat kol is saying there's a place where it should have been plural, but it was he. And God, or this bat kol, again, I keep making that mistake because I don't know that the bat kol is God, but I don't know that it's not God. "I am the witness," the bat kol says. "You can believe me." So presumably here everyone heard it, I would say. I think because they all accepted this testimony of Samuel, "I haven't taken anything," but the witness was the bat kol, not a human witness, for what it's worth. All right, and the third case?
At the tribunal of Solomon, as it is said, "And the king answered and said, Give her the living child, and in no way slay it. She is his mother." certain, maybe she had been acting craftily, but it was Bat Kol that came forth and said, she is his mother.
Right? We all have always wondered when we hear that story, how is it that Solomon is so sure which is the mother of the living baby? And the answer here is not that Solomon is so smart, but the Bat Kol came and told him. I'm not sure what to make of this. But now we get a little bit of objection to Bat Kol. Okay, keep going.
Said Rabbah, how can we be sure of this? Maybe Judah had reckoned the days and months and found them to coincide. For what we see, we may presume, but we presume not what we see not. Again, Samuel may have taken all Israel collectively, using the singular expression, as it is written elsewhere, O Israel, thou art saved by the Lord with an everlasting salvation. Ye shall not be ashamed. And Solomon likewise, because he saw one woman was compassionate and the other was not compassionate. Only, of course, these interpretations are points of traditional law.
So I wanted to bring this to show you both the examples of a Bat Kol speaking to biblical characters, and being able to testify, if you will, or to make sure that justice happened, right? That Tamar didn't get killed. And it's not every rabbi accepts this as being, they were you, Ellie, right? He said, yeah, how can we know this, right? How can we know about the Bat Kol? There are perfectly good reasons, explanations for something other than the Bat Kol. And right there on the same page. So there's not universal love, appreciation, acceptance of Bat Kol, but we're going to look at the Bat Kol stories. It's kind of controversial in the Talmud itself. Okay? The next one, because we said that sacred text was God's word, if you will, right? So one of the questions is, how do we understand sacred texts and what makes up sacred texts? Okay? And Bat Kol is going to have something to say about that a little bit. All right? So, Evelyn, you want to go ahead? Rabbi Jeremiah. The one on the right side at the top.
Oh, okay, sure.
Sorry.
Rabbi Jeremiah, or some say Rabbi Hia, Abam also said the Targum of the Pentateuch was composed by Angelos, the proselyte under the guidance of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua.
And Rabbi Joshua. What's a Targum?
It's a translation.
Targum is translation. We use the term mostly now to refer to the Aramaic translations of the text, but it can also be used to describe the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Bible and certainly the Torah. And Targum is controversial, right? Translating the text is controversial. We're going to see some of the ways. There's actually potentially a mistake here that they actually mean a different. Aquila actually is the translator who might have worked under Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua, but don't worry about it for now. Okay, so now we're going to go to another Targum.
The Targum of the Prophets was composed by Jonathan ben Uziel under the guidance of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi.
Okay, so those are our guys, right? Our prophets. And of course, it's very clear because the translation comes a couple of hundred years after because this translation takes place after the destruction of the temple, and it's a couple of hundred years after Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So the answer is there was a tradition, whatever. But that's not the most important piece. Go ahead. What happened when the Targum was done by Jonathan ben Uziel?
In the land of Israel, thereupon quaked over an area 400 parasangs by 400 parasangs, and the Bat Kol came forth and exclaimed, "Who is this that has revealed my secrets to mankind?"
Okay, so a bit of an earthquake here in response to the translation. And the bat kol is not happy. Why?
Because they translated from holy language.
Yeah, somehow revealed secrets that should only be available potentially to those who know Hebrew. Right, and that's been a problem with translations. It was a problem. It's funny because it was a problem for Christians when they translated the Latin and Greek translations into the vernacular. Right, that was one of the earliest issues in the early Reformation period, or even before that. But the question of translating holy texts and who then gets access to reading the holy texts and understanding them. And the Bat Kol here isn't real happy with the translation of the Nevi'im, of the prophets. Okay? But Jonathan ben Uziel is not afraid of the Bat Kol. And what does he say?
It is I who have revealed thy secrets to mankind. It is fully known to thee that I have not done this for my own honor or for the honor of my father's house, but for thy honor I have done it, that dissension may not increase in Israel.
What do you think of that answer? So first of all, Bat Kol doesn't scare everybody, right? And as we saw in the halachic discussion, just because a Bat Kol says something doesn't mean that the Bat Kol is right in the mind of the human being. Right? So why is Jonathan ben Uziel feel that he's done this for God's sake?
Because by this point, there are multiple periods of exile and in different places. And not everyone will know how to read the original text. And so we all need to know what the text says, and not all of us have the ability to learn the original. So
right. So it is a problem though, because any translation is a commentary. And his purpose is to keep dissension away out of Israel. That is, let's have a clear understanding of what this means. All right, and that will keep Jews from fighting with each other over what it means. I was thinking about those of you in shul this past week. Rabbi read President Herzog's talk in Hebrew, and I think he read it partly because there was time, but also because it was beautiful Hebrew. But it's not a question of beautiful Hebrew. It's a question of, is something clearer in Hebrew? And Jonathan ben Uziel is saying, no, it's not necessarily clear in the Hebrew. We need a modern contemporary translation, he says. That way, Jews will understand what you mean, which is a really interesting argument. Let's finish the story. Okay.
He further sought to reveal by a targum the inner meaning of the Hagiographa,
which is the Ketuvim, the writings, which is the 5 Megillot and Psalms and Job and all those guys. Okay.
But if Bat Kol went forth and said enough, what was the reason? Because the day of the Messiah is foretold.
Okay. And so the Bat Kol finally says, fine. Took your first argument, I took your second argument, but you can't translate Ketuvim. In particular, it turns out what you can't translate is the book of Daniel, which anybody who's ever read it can't translate it anyway. It just makes no sense. And it's already half in Aramaic or some portion in Arabic. So it's interesting, but the Bat Kol wants to hold on and not make certain knowledge accessible and easy to find, which is an interesting idea, because the rabbis in our previous stories have said, you gave us the Torah, we interpret it, and that's how it is. And the Bat Kol is saying there's a limit to that. So I just thought it's kind of interesting, and it's an interesting place for a Bat Kol to show up. All right. The next set of stories are really they're really interesting, and there is a somewhat large. We're still on the same page. We're still on page 2. the question of the bat kol and the Holy One's decree of destruction and exile. And in response to the destruction of the first temple and the exile and the second temple, there is a somewhat large group of bat kol appearances related to those two destructions and the exile. And think about why that might be. I brought you three, which are going to take us slightly different places. So the first one is Lamentations Rabbah, which is on the left side there. Steve, can you read this? Where the left side in the second one from the middle reading on the left side of page 2.
Thereupon Moses said to Jeremiah, walk before me so that I may go and bring them in and see who dares to touch them. Jeremiah replied, it is impossible for me to walk along the road because he is slain.
Oh, so this is the moment after the destruction of the first temple, and some of the Jews are fleeing to Egypt, and that's where Jeremiah goes. But there's so many corpses, right? Unfortunately, we can see these images, right? There's so many corpses on the road. Jeremiah says, I can't walk there, even though Moses is saying, walk with me. Steve, why can't Jeremiah walk there? Because of the corpses?
He's the Kohen.
Right, Jeremiah's a Kohen. Kohen can't walk where there are those corpses. Okay, but Moses says to Jeremiah,
He said to him, nevertheless, let us go.
Okay, so we'll keep reading. We'll get to the bat kol. This is part of one of the most powerful long midrashim that I know, in which, and there's a couple of different versions of it, but these are midrashim in which the rabbis want the patriarchs, they want Moses to come down from heaven or to go back up and to argue with God and say, how could you do this? How could you exile your people? And different versions of the story, each of them refuses and says, I have faults in me. I can't tell God that. I can't tell God. And in the most common version of this, we're not going to see it because there's another 3 pages before we would get to that. It's Rachel Imenu, who gets God to say, I'll take them back. And she says, who are you to be Jewish? Who are you to be jealous? Right? You're God. What are you jealous of? I had a right to be jealous of my sister when instead of marrying me, Jacob married her. And I gave my sister the secret code, so in the middle of the night, Jacob wouldn't embarrass her. What's your problem? She says to him. And that's when God says a voice, and that is one reason why Rachel is buried on the road and not in the cave of Machpelah. That question came up, I think maybe at Sudash this week, but because the exiles are going to go past her grave, and she is going to cry out and say, your children will come back. Right? It's really, really powerful, absolutely beautiful material. This is the beginning of that. Okay, so imagine now Jeremiah, who's still alive, hasn't crossed that boundary yet, with the people, with the exiles, he's walking with them. He's called Moses. Moses has crossed that boundary, come back. They're walking on the road, okay, and they get there. So forthwith, go ahead.
Forthwith Moses went, Jeremiah leading the way, until they arrived at the rivers of Babylon. I thought they were going to Egypt.
What?
You said they were going to Egypt.
They were going to, I thought he was going to Egypt, but he takes a little detour to Babylon. Because we have to connect a beautiful text here that you know.
When the exiles beheld Moses, they said to one another, the son of Amram has come from his grave to redeem us from the hand of our adversaries.
Isn't that beautiful? And that's one reason, and some other midrash tells us one reason Moses is buried outside of the land of Israel is so that in the time to come he can, like he led the people out of Egypt, he can lead us back into Israel. Because it's a beautiful text, and that's the assumption that the exiles say. But listen to what the bat kol says.
The bat kol issued forth and announced, this is a decree for me.
Okay, so
Moses at once said to them, my children, it is not possible to take you back now, since it is so decreed, but the all-present will soon cause you to return. finally lifted their voices and loud weeping until the sound of it ascended above. So is it written, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept.
Okay, so this text, God says, I am the one, or the Bat Kol, at least speaking on behalf of God, says, this is my decree that you are going to be exiled because of what you did. The Bat Kol doesn't say that, but God takes responsibility for the exile. That's it. Not changing. Okay? But now we're gonna look at two different things that happen with a Bat Kol. So Barbara, can you read the bottom part there? The rabbi is Rabba Bar Chana, who is also Rabba, and he gets into an interesting tour of the desert area with some Arab. It's interesting the word Arab is used in the Gemara there. So the Arab says, "Hey, you want to come see the people of Korach, the community of Korach? They remember the earth swallowed them alive, and if you're there at the right time, the earth opens up, and they all say Moses was right, we were wrong." Okay, so he gets another piece of a tour. That this is another part of that tour.
He said unto me, Come and I will show you Mount Sinai. When I arrived, I saw the scorpions surrounded it, and they stood like white asses. I heard about that Bat-Kol. It says Bat-Kol.
I heard a Bat Kol, yeah.
Saying, Woe is me that I have made an oath, and now that I have made the oath, who will release me?
Okay.
When I came before the rabbis, they said unto me, Every Abba is an ass, and every Bar Hana is a fool. You should have said, Mufach Lach. He, however, thought that perhaps it was the oath in connection with the flood. And the rabbis, if so, why? Woe is me.
All right. I know it's a little confusing. Okay.
Don't get it.
Rabba Bar Chana gets to Mount Sinai. It's surrounded by scorpions. It's not actually going up there. I don't know. I don't totally understand that whole image. But when Rabba Bar Chana, he's now telling the rabbis. He went back and he said, "Guess what I did on my summer vacation?" And he says, "I heard a bat kol saying, 'Woe is me that I made an oath, and now that I have made an oath, who will release me?'" Okay. And the rabbis said, "You are an idiot. You are an ass." And there's some play on words there that I think is funnier in the Hebrew, but I don't know it all. And you, Bar Khan, are a fool. You should have released the Bat Kol from its oath, right? Certain rabbis have the right to annul vows. The Bat Kol is saying, I made a vow, and I hate this vow. And I want to be released from this vow that my people are in exile, is how you're supposed to read it. Okay, and the rabbis say, you had the power to release God from the vow of exile for the people. You should have said, whatever this phrase is, I release you. Baruch Hana says, well, I thought this was the oath in connection with the flood. God says, I'm never going to flood the world again. And he doesn't want to take a chance that God's going to flood the world again. And the rabbis say, but he said, woe is me. The Bat Kol said, woe is me. How could you have the wrong oath that God made? So it's a really, again, an interesting text, an interesting statement of rabbinic power, but also a statement of the rabbis wanting to believe that God did not want to keep this oath. That this guy had the power to change it, to end the exile, and he didn't. So it's an interesting. We're going to see another example of this. This next piece is from Babylonian Talmud Brachot 3a, and Rabbi Yossi is walking on the street, and he goes into ruins to pray, and Elisha says, "Why did you go into the ruins?" And Elisha says, "You like that was stupid. You could have been heard. Don't worry about being interrupted while you're praying." So pick it up, Barbara, if you could pick it up where it says, and he said to me, what voice did you hear in the room?
And he said to me, what voice did you hear in the room? I replied, I heard a heavenly echo, cooing like a dove, cooing like a dove.
Okay, and there's the translation of bat kol as a heavenly echo. It's the translation here, not the word is bat kol.
Saying, woe to me that I destroyed my horse and burned my temple, and burned my temple, and exiled my children among the nations of the world. Elijah said to me, by your life and by your head, not at this moment alone does it explain yourself, but 3 times every single day. Moreover, whenever the people of Israel enter the synagogue and houses of study and respond in Kaddish, may his great name be blessed. The Blessed One shakes his head and says, happy is the king who is thus praised in his house. When the temple still stood, but now, woe to the father who has banished his children, and woe to the children who have been banished from their father's table.
Okay, so again, we have these stories of what God is thinking, although, it's the bat kol that says, I'm so sorry I did this, right? But I also wanted to bring this text because of the description of the bat kol here. What's the description of the bat kol? What does it sound like? It's cooing like a dove almost, like how did he hear the word? So when I said to you, bat kol can be loud, it can be short, it can be, and it can sound like the cooing of a dove, and yet it can be understood. Let's see. So clearly, we're not going to have time to go through every text in as much detail. So actually, I'm not going to take too much time. I'm going to tell you what the next set of texts are, which are a little bit two sets of themes: martyrdom and a place in the world to come. So one of the things that a bat kol seems to do an awful lot in the Talmud, and even later in the way some of these stories are retold in Jewish folklore outside of the Talmud, is that people are often wanting to ask, do I have a place in the world to come, and where is it, and who's going to be my neighbor? Is apparently certainly in folklore, but even coming out of the Talmud. And so they hear who's going to be their neighbor, and they go back to the bat kol and they say, why? Why am I going to be next to the butcher? I'm a great rabbi, right? And so there's a whole series there's a whole collection of these, who's going to be your neighbor in the world to come, and are you going to go to the world to come? And so I wanted to show you, the first one on the left is one of the very famous ones, which is the death of Rabbi Akiva. And how Rabbi Akiva says he dies on saying the word echad, and the very end there's a bat kol that says, "Happy is Akiva, for you're destined to the life in the world to come." It's this. I don't know who's being comforted here. I think it is a text that's attempting to bring comfort to somebody, but I'm not sure. The other one, the one from the Avodah Zarah on the right side, is again a fairly well-known one. These were some of the 10 martyrs that we read about on Yom Kippur. It's the death of Hanina ben Tradian. And what happens here is he's being burnt with the Torah. These are the famous lines, the letters are flying free, right? The Torah scroll is burning, the letters are flying free. The end of that story is that the Roman soldier says, let me help you die faster. And that turns out to be okay. At first, Hanina doesn't want it. But the soldier says, look, I'm going to free you. I'm going to make you die sooner. Promise me I will go to the world to come. And he makes the fire go faster. He stops the thing that was stopping him from dying. He jumps into the fire himself. And then a voice is heard that says, the bat kol exclaimed, Rabbi Hanina ben Trajan and the executioner have both been assigned to the world to come. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wept, and he said, some people work a whole life to get into the world to come, and some people get it in an hour. And there are a couple of other stories of Roman soldiers who end up doing a similar thing and getting the same message. The piece from Gittin is a telling of the mother of 7 sons, which we know of as Hannah and her 7 sons, and we tell it in the context of the Hanukkah story. And its first telling is in the book of Maccabees. And she doesn't get her name till the Middle Ages. The same story is told of a mother during the time of the Roman persecutions and the seven sons. I just want to bring this one because the piece that often to me is most interesting is not the bat kol, which is going to show up, but when the very last son is about to die, they let his mother kiss him, and she says to him, "My son, go and say to your father Abraham, you bound one son to the altar, but I have bound 7 altars." And that becomes an interesting and shows up a lot in the Crusade Chronicles of the Middle Ages, which is where the martyrs say, "Go up and tell them, you only sacrificed one son, and you didn't even have to sacrifice. We sacrificed for real our children." So it's an interesting and angry tradition here.
They're
Yeah.
saying that in Israel now.
I'm sure, yeah. It turns out to be a very powerful trope there. And here, when the mother she throws herself down, there's actually an interesting couple of stories in which a person commits suicide for various reasons, and a bat kol says it's okay. And here she's the joyful mother of children who has raised these martyrs. So it's a difficult text, but it's interesting that there are a couple of other stories associated with somebody jumping off a building for some reason, and the bat kol says it's okay. Right? So, as I say, the bat kol is a very complicated thing. I, all right, go ahead. Let's see. Stuart, can you read this is just a couple of random texts. A cave grave, some birds, and a halt to too much piety. So, Stuart, can you read for the text from the Midrash of Ecclesiastes?
Yeah. Be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Be not more righteous than your Creator, as in the case of Shaul, whom it is written, and Shaul came to the city of Amalek, etc. Rabbi Huna and Rabbi Benaiah say he began to cavil at his Creator, arguing, "Thus has the Holy One, blessed be He, ordered you. Now go and smite Amalek. Slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. If the men sinned, how have the women and children, cattle, ox, and ass sinned?" A bat kol went forth and said, "Be not righteous over much, more than thy Creator." The rabbis say Shaul began to cavil, that's a word I've never seen before,
It's
at
like
the
to
precept
kvetch about.
of the heifer, whose neck was to be broken, saying, "Scripture declares it shall break the heifer's neck there in the valley." A man commits murder, and the neck of a fat heifer is broken. If a man has sinned, how has the animal sinned? A bat kol went forth and said, "Be not righteous over much."
So again, one of those really interesting texts where the bat kol isn't all about compassion. Like we want a bat kol to be about compassion. This is, and this is a text which says, and we all are troubled when we read that Haftarah right before Purim, in which kind of everybody gets killed and Saul loses his kingship. But the bat kol has a certain kind of message. And it can be a troubling one. The next piece is really sweet. We had this is connected a little bit to some of the stuff we looked at with last time with where is the Garden of Eden. And one of the things we saw is that Abraham knew where the cave of Machpelah, where he should be buried, because of the scent of the Garden of Eden, which Adam and Eve were buried right next to it. And so the beautiful scent of the Garden of Eden, you'll see that if you read those texts. Abraham smelled it. He knew exactly where he was supposed to be buried. So there's that whole tradition that Machpelah is right next to the Garden of Eden. Um, but this is just a sweet story, even though it has a bad call. So, John, you want to try reading it?
This Rabbi Benaha
Uh-huh.
used to mark out caves where there were dead bodies. When he came to the cave of Abraham, he found Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, standing at the entrance.
And there is a tradition, I don't know that we read it, that Eliezer was one of the people who went to heaven without dying.
What is Abraham doing? Well, he said to him, what is Abraham doing? He replied, he is sleeping in the arms of Sarah, and she is looking fondly at his head. He said, go and tell him that Bana'ah is standing at the entrance. Said Abraham to him, let him enter. It is well known that there is no passion in this world.
Okay, so the problem, like it feels like it shouldn't be modest to come when Abraham and Sarah are in bed cuddling, but apparently he shouldn't.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah, don't worry. Right. Keep going.
So he went in, surveyed the cave, and came out again. When he came to the cave of Adam, a voice came forth from heaven, saying, thou hast beholden the likeness of my likeness. My likeness itself thou mayest not behold. But he said, I want to mark out the cave. The measurement of the inner one is the same as that of the outer one, came the answer. Those who hold that there was one chamber above another say that the answer was. The measurement of the lower one is the same as that of the upper one.
Okay, so just really quickly, Adam is created in the likeness of God. Abraham is created in the likeness of Adam. So he's not allowed to go see Adam's grave because that's the likeness of God, the Bat Kol says. You can't go there. You can see the likeness of the likeness, but you can't see Adam. But I just thought, especially given the text that we had looked at, both in terms of Eliezer and then in terms of this cave, I thought that was sweet. All right, I'm going to, because it's 10 after already. So there's some interesting stories about Rabbi, what's his name? Shimon Bar Yochai, and you may be familiar that he hid in the cave with his son for 13 years. There are two different stories about what happened when he came out. And one of them is that when they first came out, he and his son, they couldn't believe that people were still living in a world where the Romans were, the world wasn't. They looked at people and they would destroy them. And the Bat Kol said, go back into the cave because you can't live that way. The other text is an interesting one because Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, when he comes out of the cave, he hears a Bat Kol speaking about a bird that, the birds would fly by and the Bat Kol would say, this one will be caught and this one will survive. And this one, and it goes back to the idea, I think, in Job that God knows every sparrow. What happens to every sparrow is certainly about us. So there were two different interesting pieces. The one that goes across to the bottom is from the Testament of Abraham, which is one of those outside of the Bible texts that was preserved for us. It's first century, so it's really old. It's actually older than some of the midrashic material, but it does have a bat kol in it. And Testament of Abraham is in that same thing. If you remember Enoch and all those really weird things. So Abraham gets taken up to heaven by Michael, and he's flying all around. And Abraham sees people sinning, and he looks at them and he destroys them. And finally, it's like the where it says number 12. Straight away there came a voice from heaven to the commander-in-chief, that's the same Michael, saying thus, Commander-in-chief Michael, command the chariot to stop, turn Abraham away so he may not see all the earth, because he could destroy everybody. And so it's this interesting, it's not the Abraham we think of that gets angry. We think of Abraham as, wanting to save people from Sodom, even though they survived. But even though they sinned, he knew they sinned. He still said to God, "You need to save them." This Abraham in Enoch and here in the Testament of Abraham is angry about sin, and the Bat Kol has to stop him from trying to be too righteous, from trying to be, hold everybody to standards of perfection, which the Testament of Abraham believes that Abraham in life was perfect. Okay, So it's just interesting, and we find the bat call there. So I want to end with really quickly. When I was in the pulpit, I would always end Yom Kippur services with this phrase, um, and and you'll see it all the way on the bottom on the right side. The idea is that as we get from, in this text, as we get from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, parts of our sins are forgiven, parts of our sins are forgiven. We get to Yom Kippur, and everybody's worried, will it count? And and it says. And it says, a bat kol goes forth and says to them, go thy way, eat thy bread with joy, your prayer has been heard. And I always love to send the congregation out with that. But there's a whole collection of these comments on go thy way, eat thy bread with joy. One of them is when is this heard? When children leave their schools, a bat kol says, go forth and say to them, go thy way, eat thy bread with joy. The breath of your mouth has been accepted to me like sweet savor of incense. Likewise, when Israelites go out from synagogues and house of study, a bat kol goes forth and says to them, go thy way and eat thy bread with joy. Your prayer has been heard before me. And I just thought in this world, some of these texts have been very difficult, very painful texts, and in the world we live with. And so I wanted to end with these beautiful teachings of comfort and promise. So I hope everybody enjoyed this series. It's been a real strange journey. I'm really glad I had the opportunity to study, and hopefully we'll do some more learning in the spring. So,
When was this? When was this?
So most of this material is Talmudic material.
This one too?
Well, that's Midrash. So it's either Talmud or Midrash. So the collection is we'd have to look it up in the introduction, but.
But this is not modern.
Oh, none of this is modern. No. 4th, 5th, 6th centuries of the Common Eras were these Midrash Rabbicons.
So where did we see the video of the middle one? Second one.
I have to give it to Linda.
So, yeah.
I have it.
I don't have to. So Linda's been waiting to post it because she wanted people to come in person, but she'll post when it's available on the show website.
Question I have, the thing that I thought was,
Thank you, Steve.